What is the key to a good schedule? And why do people struggle so much with managing schedules so that a job is completed on time? That is the topic of conversation today with my guest, Michael Pink. He is the CEO of SmartPM, a leading project controls solution for the commercial construction industry. Michael has over 20 years of experience in the construction industry, and he is an expert in making sure that you understand where you're at on your projects when it comes to the critical path, and that everyone on your projects fully understands what needs to be done to achieve the schedule. So enjoy my conversation today with Michael, and thank you for listening to Construction Genius. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Mike, welcome to Construction Genius.
Thank you.
Great to have you on the show. I want to kick it right in. You're all about the construction schedule. So what is the key to a good construction schedule?
Well, there's a lot of different keys, but number one, if I'm to drill it all down to like one key, is that it's built using best practices. And there's a lot of them that most people don't know about.
Okay. So let's talk about that. What are some of the best practices of a good schedule?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, there's a few metrics and a few things that you always have to remember when building a good schedule, and that's the rule of every activity must have a predecessor and a successor. That's quite often an area of error. There's only two activities that shouldn't have either a predecessor or a successor, one or the other, and that's the first activity, because there's nothing preceding it, and the last activity. So the number one rule, that I think all schedulers know, and all PMs should know, is that every activity should have one thing that comes before it and one thing that comes after it, or else it's generally an incomplete schedule.
Okay, so I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but what you said sounds incredibly obvious to me, and yet you said this is an error that many people often make. Is that really the case?
Yeah, it's called an open-ended activity, and it's forgetting to put something after it, even if it's the finish milestone. It basically opens up float, and then in the more that it happens, the more it results in compression, by design, and activities that can stack on their own. And when you have that situation, it really results in a critical path that is not really accurate in many cases.
Okay. So every activity must have a predecessor and a successor, or a successor, except the first and the last activity. What are some other best practices that we need to nail if we're going to make sense of our schedule and execute accordingly?
Sure. Another issue that we see a lot is a lot of long duration activities. The rule of thumb, according to the DCMA methodology, is less than 2 months. No activity should be greater than 2 months. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that there are specific activities that should be over 2 months or can't be less than 2 months. But what that rule is all about is a level of detail that makes sense. If you think about a construction activity specifically, 2 months of time to do something is a hard thing to gauge from a progress perspective. They should be in bite-sized pieces. I think a week is generally a good rule of thumb, or no more than a month on a construction activity. And if worst comes to worst, go 2 months. But this is a risk, because if you don't have an accurate progress calculation, which only gets harder with bigger scopes, which is evident through longer duration activities, you end up, you can say the wrong percentage, which results in the wrong remaining duration, which could then ultimately result in something becoming critical or non-critical that's not actually true.
So it sounds like so far what we're talking about is thinking logically and paying attention to detail. This is not necessarily rocket science. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah. there's other things like not putting a ton of constraints in, and that really ties back to the lack of logic. If an activity does not have a predecessor and it's not going to happen for a while, you would pick a date and you'd put a constraint, and that's a start constraint, and then nothing's really driving it. So if something truly is driving it and you forgot to put in the logic and you dropped in a constraint to hold it, when the date comes and its predecessor's not done, it's the schedule thinks it should be happening even though it shouldn't. And then there's a finish constraint issue. If you put in finish constraints and you update the schedule and the schedule's delayed, the float value turns negative, and the program's designed to say anything 0 or less is critical, whereas that's not what the true critical path is. The longest path is the true critical path. So that's another area that we want to focus in on, is not building a schedule with constraints, because that's the user guessing dates with no movement of that until the time comes, and also creating an environment where more things appear critical to the naked eye than are actually critical to delaying the end date of a job.
Okay, explain that a little bit more to me then. So I think I got you what you were saying there about something becoming, it's interesting though, something becoming more critical than it actually is, and therefore drawing attention that perhaps isn't necessary. Did I hear that right? Give me an example of that.
Sure. One of the most important features of a CPM scheduling program like Microsoft Project or Primavera is that once it takes all the things that you add to it, all the activities and all the logic, it produces a plan over time with all of that taken into account. But it doesn't stop there. Each and every activity has a float value assigned to it. And the float value is essentially how much room for delay does this activity have. And if the float value is 0, that means that on this path of things, there is no room for delay without impacting the end date of a job. And that's what the true critical path is. It's the series of activities that dictates the end date of the job. So those activities have no room for error. Now, say you put a constraint on that end date, right? And you update it a month and you lose a month, right? You didn't do anything in that month, but you put a constraint on that last activity that said we cannot get finished past this date. But now we're a month late. Anything that has a float value of 0 to 30 days will turn red, and now you'll have even more activities that are critical to your, to the look of the schedule, but you don't really truly see what is driving the end date of the job anymore. Now you just see anything that has float of 0 to 30, and that doesn't help you make good decisions on resources. And that little area is a challenge, because a lot of people put finish constraints on a lot of activities midway through the job, and now the viewer of the schedule file itself can't actually decipher, is this an activity that's critical towards driving a milestone, or is this critical towards driving the end date? And there's two major differences there. One is it's not going to result in extended general conditions, and the other one is that it will. So because of the nature of liquidated damages being assigned to interim milestones, people are naturally thinking that's the right thing to do, but what they're not realizing is they're sort of making a mistake in how to use the schedule, sabotaging themselves, so to speak, to look at the color scheming to make decisions on where the important resources really need to go to manage to something that costs time and money versus something that may not cost anything, and or liquidated damages associated to it. So the knee jerk has been to put in that finish constraint so that you can see how late a milestone is, but what it does is sabotage the critical path of the job.
So let me ask you this: how much of that is driven by subs giving the GCs information, schedule information, that with the intention of making sure that their stuff's a priority, and then the GC just taking it and plugging it in, and then getting a path that doesn't necessarily reflect reality?
I would say very little is coming from the sub. The sub generally produces a plan at a high level, and I want to go from this area to that area, and here's how long each one's going to take. they'll build a very simple series of activities, and it's not like they send it over and it gets cut and pasted. It's usually they have the discussion, and then the scheduler on the GC side will build it out in there, and
Okay.
start to add the logic. So I don't think the subs are causing that. It's more done by somebody who doesn't understand all of the best practices out there.
Excellent. So let's take a little more time to look at those best practices. We've talked about every activity having a predecessor or a successor, making sure that we're dialed in on the long duration of activities and a clear understanding of constraints. What are some other best practices we need to focus on?
Another one is the types of logic ties you put in. Generally speaking, there's three types of logic ties that are important. One is the finish to start tie. It's basically saying that a successor can't start before its predecessor is finished, right? Um, and then there's a start to start tie and some lag. It's basically saying when I start one activity, a couple days later I can start the next, and I don't have to wait till it's done. And there's certainly many examples of that. And then there's the same thing with finish to finish, like if paint in a drywall, like if you're talking about a whole room, you don't have to put all the drywall up to start the paint, and you can't finish the paint until the drywall's up. And the rule of thumb is to limit that, and that's because that there, for the most part, you should try to clear a trade out before the next trade comes in. And that also sort of aligns with the length of the activities. The less detail you're putting into an activity, the more it's going to be staggered with, another activity. But the more detail you put in, the more you should strive to get one chunk done before you start the next. There are examples of things that will always be start to start and finish to finish. But if your schedule is, 90% of your logic ties are start to start or finish to finish, then there's a total lack of detail or an absolute ton of compression. So those are indicators of a schedule that's not actually been built well enough to manage a job. And these are all indicators. This isn't gospel. Different types of projects at different sizes and different ways in which people do things. These numbers can fluctuate a little bit, which is why we, at our company, have produced a schedule quality rubric that's customizable by organization or by project type or project size. Raising these things as red flags, but not basically saying then therefore your job's going to be terrible. It's just raising the risk metric up to know that there's a potential based on how this schedule's been built that could result in risks to mismanagement. And I don't think that there's a one size fits all deal here, which is why I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the DCMA. I like all of their calculations as indicators, but I also think that there should be ranges of acceptability based on many different factors related to the job.
What's the one range of acceptability, one piece of flexibility that people often miss, and they're too hard on it? They're saying, they're too rigid, where they need you just to chill a little bit, and that would actually.
That's the should have started. That's the types of logic. A lot of times when especially when I'm training a company or our company's training a company, they the rule of thumb by the DCMA, which is Defense Contractors Management Association, put together a rule of 14 checks that you should be looking at, and if they didn't fit the box, then you've got a fail. You failed the schedule test. But like I said, they basically claim that you should have no more than 5% of your relationships being start to start and 5% of your relationships being finish to finish out of all of your relationships. But if you think about it like a multifamily, if you were to do that and you were going room to room to room, in order to fit that bucket, you would have very small durations and then go to the next room and very small durations. But if you think about the floor, it's usually multifamily or office building contractors that argue it. If you think about the floor, they have flow built in from room to room to room. And if you're doing, drywall first and then you're doing tape and finish second, you're not going to wait until it's over. And since you have that ability to go room to room to room and you've got an overall duration, I think you should relax a little bit on that rule of thumb. But then there's the missing logic rule. There should be no missing logic in any schedule, and I don't care what type of project it is.
Excellent. This is great. So, what else do we need to know? What else do we need to focus on? What's that one area where time and time again you see people swinging and missing when it comes to the schedule?
You're talking about swinging and missing on building the schedule?
Yeah.
I think, another metric that we calculate, which is a little bit different, is I want to know how much float is in your schedule. Like how much, once you have built your schedule, assuming you've tried to build it with good practices, I want to know how much float, the average amount of float, and how many activities have over a month or two of float. And if your number's in like the 75, 80, 90, or even more than 50% range, that's basically saying half of the activities in your schedule have 2 months of time to be delayed before impacting the end date of the job. And what that usually indicates to me is that either there's a lot of missing logic, or if there's not a lot of missing logic, then you forgot one very important tie, and that's crew logic. A lot of people are wired to put in what's called hard logic. Like I cannot put on a second layer of concrete before I put on the first layer or first level. And that's just impossible. And I am not going to be able to hang ductwork until there's an actual ceiling, or a roof until there's a building. There's things that you just can't do. But then there are things that you could do. For instance, you could put 2 crews out there putting up drywall, one on one floor, one on the other. You could do it for the entire building, but generally you have 1 crew. And when, a lot of times if some early delays are happening and you didn't hold that tie between floor to floor and one floor got delayed and the other one's on time, those trades are going to stack and you're not going to have 2 crews. And the schedule is now going to start telling a story that's not actually the way in which you need to manage the job. And all of that's going to impact the critical and near critical path. So I would say that one of the biggest hidden gems we noticed, having looked at about 120,000 schedules in our database, was one of the biggest problems in construction is people forget crew logic.
So tell us a little bit more about that. What are some things for me to look for to let me know that I'm missing the mark there?
Yeah, it's a lot of high float. If you think about a building, and you're going up level 1 to level 2 to level 3 to level 4, the look of the schedule looks staggered when you create that baseline, because the concrete activities are holding these ties. And then, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and windows and all that, they're all looking like they're getting done in sequence from a high level, but they have not been connected with logic, so that you don't know which trade is causing the most impact. The schedule's compressing and stacking trades by design, and the critical path is usually going up the building and out the top floor, and not through the trades, which ultimately dictate, progress. And that to me is one of the biggest ones. So there's 2 ways to see that. You see a critical path that looks a little funny, like up the building and out the top floor. It's basically saying that if you get the structure done on time and you finish out the top floor in the allotted amount of time, then everything's going to be fine. But in general, all the trades mixing up in the middle would have no impact. It would just require more people. That's the issue. And if you don't lock in those important trades with crew logic based on the number of crews that you're intending to have, that schedule is not going to react when you do an update and change the critical path, so you know which trade is causing the most problems. It's just always going to say up the building and out the top floor until, one of the floors takes too long, right?
Hey, this is Eric. Thank you for listening to my discussion here with Michael, all things scheduling. And let's just have a quick break to remind you about my book, Construction Genius, Effective, Hands-On, Practical, Simple, No BS. Leadership, strategy, sales, and marketing advice for construction companies. This is what you do. You go out to Amazon. You purchase 10 copies. That's $200. Then what you do is you email me and you say, Eric, I purchased 10 copies. And you know what I'll do? I'll come into your office via Zoom with your leadership team, do a Q&A around the book, and also a bonus leadership training session. And that has a value of $2,500, but you'll get it for just $200 if you buy 10 or more copies. So go out to Amazon right now and click on the link, or rather type into the box, Construction Genius, and my book will pop up. You buy 10 copies, you contact me. We'll have an awesome time in that 1 hour Q&A and leadership training session. And now back to my conversation with Michael. It's interesting. So how can owners, GCs, and subs work together to manage the schedule effectively?
Well, I think a lot of discussion needs to ensue. I think the process should be as follows. Once the baseline has been established, the GC should be out there updating the data on a given time frame. It could be every 2 weeks. I think a month is about as long as you should wait. You could do it every week, but they should go out and status the job. They should go say what started, what date, what's activities finished on what dates in that time frame, and what activities are ongoing, and estimate progress with a methodology that's not just guessing, but at least being able to look at it and guess 50%, 40%, that sort of thing. Once that's completed, you update the schedule to see in that period of time, based on all the progress we did in that period of time, what happened to the end date, right? Usually, if you wait a month, the end date's going to slip. And that's the point in time where you need to talk to the relevant subs about, mitigating some delay that have happened. What you will be able to identify pretty quickly if you build a good schedule, what the critical path is now, and what trades need to be discussed on recovering from delay, but not just running out and making that change to the schedule. Going out and having a discussion first of some of the ideas that they might have to speed up those tasks, whether it's getting more resources, whether it's getting more resources today or down the road, ways in which they can speed up the durations. They need to get that subcontractor to buy in, like maybe working weekends for the next month. I don't know.
So let me ask you then. Let's say I'm a GC going out to the job site or meeting with the sub. Just give me some key questions that I need to be asking him or her so that I can get my hands around any of the schedule issues and make sure that the project's moving forward.
Well, after you do the update, you'll see what happened, and maybe a delay happened. Maybe if the end date moved out, you'll see that there was a specific trade that caused that. I mean, the number one question I would ask is, why did that happen? If it was an owner issue, I'd point it out to the owner and say, look, this activity drove the critical path, and now we've lost a little bit of time, and how do you want us to proceed? If you're talking to a sub, you could say, look, you're not keeping up with durations. I want to know why. And by the way, going forward, we need to come up with a plan that will overcome the delays that have already occurred. How do you think we'll achieve that? Weekend work, extra shift, staggering some of your stuff, down the road or today. Get their insights on how they're going to recover, because, when there is a delay, and usually the changes happen to the schedule to overcome delay. The problem is that the scheduler or the PM just start dictating things to shorten out the duration without actually having the conversation and discussing the ramifications and the causation for those issues. Not giving them a chance to kind of weigh in usually results in them not actually doing it, or it could result in inefficiencies that they didn't agree to. And that's where the roller coaster effect of arguments and headbutting really starts.
It's interesting. So at what point do you think should a GC be considering hiring a full-time scheduler as opposed to just delegating it out somewhere else in the organization? Yeah, like revenue size or number of projects, or just based on your experience.
Well, I don't think it's all necessary to hire a scheduler. I think the problem has been that most PMs and supers have never actually been taught, what this process is all about and how you do it well. We actually, as a company, saw that problem and created what we call a CPM Bootcamp, where we'll meet with supers and PMs over a 2-day period and teach them, like, what is this program actually doing, and how does it work? And how does it align with your goals? Because a lot of PMs and supers have seen a lot of crappy schedules, and they don't necessarily trust them. And we've had to teach them that there's really, your goal is to get done on time and on budget. And this tool is doing calculations for you to achieve that, and yet you're foregoing those calculations to try to do it in your head, and that's impossible. And I would say that being impossible starts on like probably a $10 million project and above.
Okay, excellent. So tell us a little more about that boot camp. What kind of stuff would someone learn going to that boot camp, and what's sort of the agenda? Where do you start, and what's your goal? Where do you want to bring them to at the end of that?
Okay. Well, I think the number one thing is we have to teach, you've heard of this program, Microsoft or Primavera, for your entire career. You're now using it. It's called a CPM scheduling program. That stands for Critical Path Method Scheduling. And what we really do need to point out is that this is a calculator. It's not just something that you put in logic and durations and it spits out a plan. That's not where it ends. The most powerful feature of this program is the float values and the criticality. That's how you make good decisions. That critical path, the definition of it is it's the path that you can't be delayed on without impacting the end date of the job. And those float values are your, indicators of how much wiggle room do you have, which is what you need to rely on to make good decisions. And there's a lot of pitfalls here, right? In the programs themselves. And if you miss a few things like a logic tie, it can alter every single number. And then you end up in that situation where you're following this thing verbatim and it's actually broken and it's making you make bad decisions, which is, that reality is probably why you've felt such hatred towards this process. But if you are understanding these best practices and you do rely on it, it's doing the math for you to answer the question that you probably have every single day. What needs to happen today to not impact the project 2 years from now? And if you don't know the answer to that question, which us humans can't figure out on our own because we don't know how to do complex math like that, and if you do, you probably wouldn't be doing this job. Seriously. But no, it's getting them to admit that they can't do that, and none of us can. It's too complicated. We're not, that's like unbelievable level of math that Einstein couldn't do. But the program is designed to answer that question day in and day out, but it does come with a responsibility. And that's that you build the schedule well enough to manage a job and you don't make a lot of these little mistakes that happen with such a complex thing, like writing 2,000 activities and assigning logic to them in a manner that's aligned with best practices. But letting them know that pain that they have felt where they thought everything was fine leading up into 70-75% when the end date blew out, is because of the challenges that exist in this process. But then we teach them what is the process for building a good quality schedule that you can rely on to make those decisions, and how do you do that. And then once we teach them that, we let them know that responsibility needs to carry through to the updating process. And in addition to maintaining that quality, you can't start to try to course correct in ways that you hope will happen over and over and over, because then you get to a schedule that's unreliable because it's impossible. And that's the compression effect. And you're not looking at the delays, you're only looking at the future. And then what's really happening is your project's delayed, you're course correcting with changes, you're compressing the job. That's going to result in your subcontractors not making money. And then they're going to leave. They're not going to bring the people you need. So you're exacerbating this problem by being overly optimistic. And by teaching them those sort of pitfalls and giving them a path to do this right and well, we see that they end up feeling much better and have a lot less stress on their jobs. And then they embrace it. But we've got to get them to buy in and to know that this isn't, dark arts. There's a real technical side to this. And we have to connect with them to the day-to-day challenges that they've had and let them know that, if you follow this process, that those stresses go away. and you look like the rock star because you're the one getting them done on time and on budget. And if there is a problem, you know exactly what it is and you know how to respond, and you press the buttons that are important to getting to your goal, and it works. And that's generally how we train them. And that goes on over a 2-day period with a couple workshops where they can see that they get a good grade on their schedule, because we've got a grading system that really checks the level of best practices that are built into their schedule. And we also do the same thing on an updating workshop. But we do some follow up after that, because we know it's a lot to digest in 2 days, and we have what's called office hours every 2 weeks or every month for an hour, where all of the people who are sort of in the midst of updating their schedule, we answer their questions for them using repetitive education, so it starts to stick. And after about 6 months, these PMs and supers are they could be schedulers at that point. But it's making them in control of their own destiny, because the problem that exists when you have a scheduler that does all the schedules and PMs and supers that build all the jobs is the scheduler doesn't necessarily understand how to build, and the PMs and supers don't necessarily know how to schedule. But when the PM and the super now get it, they take on the ownership of that and they manage effectively. And what ends up happening is they start to not have that level of stress at the end of the job. They see the problems before they happen, and these people are problem solvers. That's why they're in construction. They're good at it. They're optimistic. They go through hell to get there, but they show up to the next job. So yeah, we see it being very effective, especially to the middle market.
That's excellent. So tell us a little bit more about SmartPM.
Sure. Well, just a little bit of background on me. I was a consultant, getting involved in projects that had been delayed or over budget, or working on projects that were headed towards something that didn't look so good. And I was always asked to figure out, why is this happening? And I just always got the most out of the schedule data, because it's the only data set that sort of has every little part and piece, and for the most part it's tied logically together, so you can see how everything interrelates. No other data set provided that. So I got very very knowledgeable about extracting meaningful data from that data set, and I also saw a lot of problems. And for me, to analyze the schedule, to get to understanding those things, it was very time consuming, but powerful nonetheless. So having done it as many times as I did, I kind of got tired of it, but I also saw a lot of room for improvement. Yep. Not improving the process of scheduling itself or those programs, but looking at the data in ways that would speak towards risks and problems, and also identifying the delays causing it. That enabled us to really do our job well. There was a time constraint and an experience constraint. So I thought, a million different things that you can do, if you could do it as a human in a short amount of time, would add a lot of value. But you can't. The manual analytics is a long thing, and they pay a lot of money for consultants, so they don't hire them to do it. The only answer was to teach a computer to do it.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. We said, let's build a product that sits on top of this process and gives you the understanding that you really need to have, that solves a lot of these problems. First, you need to do the analytics.
Right.
And then you've got to put it into a presentable format so that the people involved can understand it, instead of looking at that 100-page Gantt chart that doesn't tell you much. It's all the math behind it brought up to a level where executives, project controls teams, schedulers, and site teams can all be on the same page of the issues and understand them for what they are, to make good decisions. And, part of it's making sure you're building a schedule that's good enough to manage a job. And the next piece is, once you do that, now studying performance for what it is, and then looking at the response to the performance through the updates, and then, projecting out risk issues based on the learnings you have from those updates.
Yeah. So there's so many different construction companies out there, different types. Who is in your mind, the one company that needs to go out to smartpmtech.com and talk to you? What's the one type of company that should absolutely contact you?
Oh, I would say the ones that probably get the most value the quickest? Well, there's two. I would say any company that's involved in commercial construction, the E&R top, 200, 300, they benefit from our program because they actually they have people there in project controls who are doing this stuff manually, and you only have so much time and energy to do it, and so many resources that they don't necessarily get to do everything that they could do from an analytical perspective on their jobs. These people are run ragged. But they benefit by being able to do much more depth of the analysis and really look at what the data says to start, resulting in better outcomes across their entire portfolio. So they take our product and run with it and get to do things that they never had time to do before, but they understand it thoroughly. Then there's the GCs that don't have the project controls teams, which starts in the E&R 400 and spans the complete middle market. Those are the people who don't have visibility and understanding of their jobs, and they're the ones that end up, in more claims and in those situations where their business could actually go out of business. And a lot of it's rooted into not having full visibility on performance and risk on their jobs, and not having a schedule that's built well enough to manage a job, but needing non-schedulers and non-project controls people to understand and grasp the concepts, and executives to obtain that visibility. We fill that project controls gap through technology. So I look at, all of these companies need project controls. Less than 4% of the GCs in America have those teams. We fill that void, but for the companies that do have those teams, we give them depth that they never thought they'd ever have. So GC side is benefiting greatly. And then on the owner side, making sure that your contractor is performing well and is accountable and knows how to build a good schedule is what they purchase our product for. Being able to show up to a meeting with some understanding that's not just looking at a building and hoping is a pain point that we solve on that owner's side.
Excellent. And so how can people get in touch with you?
We have a website, www.smartpmtech.com. That's smartpmtech.com. I would say the best way is to, make sure that it seems like something you're interested in and request a demo, on any one of those pages, and we'll get in touch with you. Usually we give it a free analysis as part of it, which you'll get some value out of just for meeting with us.
Excellent. So as we're wrapping up here then, Mike, let's say I've hired a new superintendent, and I want to make sure that he or she is really dialed in on how to build a schedule and how to manage a schedule well. Let's focus on the managing the schedule. What are the top 3 things I'm going to make sure that person has nailed in the first 90 days?
Well, I think first and foremost, like I talked about, you can assess a schedule, the aptitude of a scheduler, or the experience of a scheduler based on whether or not they're following those best practices. So
yes.
You want to first run their schedule through an engine like ours and see what grade did it get. Mm-hmm. Aside from that, you want to look at, how frequently do they want to update, right? If they want to update once a month, and they're putting the project at risk of delays happening without them realizing the extent of them, I think they should be updating more frequently and want to do that to see what the critical path is and, what the end date variances are and that sort of thing. If they're not doing that, then they're, more likely feeling like they can do this math in their head, which is a risk. And then from there, assessing things like compression and management of delay through looking at changes, how frequently they're changing things on the critical and near critical paths, and how much they're progressing the plan versus actual earned value. Mm-hmm. If those things start to go apart, like they're supposed to be earning more and they're not, but the end date's not changing, that's resulting in what we call compression. Those are indicators of a person who doesn't really understand the things that they need to effectively manage a job.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Michael, you've been very, very generous with your time. I appreciate your insights, and thanks for joining us today on Construction Genius.
Yeah, Eric, thank you. It's been very nice to talk with you today, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Construction Genius today. Feel free to check out Michael's website, smartpmtech.com, for all things related to interpreting scheduled data correctly and then taking the appropriate steps to make sure that you finish your projects on time. Feel free to share this episode with other people that you think would benefit from listening to Construction Genius. And thank you once again for being a faithful listener to the show.